Last Monday night, something happened that sent political observers, media analysts, and Trump's critics into an absolute frenzy. And if you only saw the headlines screaming about mental decline and manic behavior, you completely missed what actually occurred and why it matters. Between 7 p.m. and midnight Eastern Time, President Trump posted more than 160 times on Truth Social. That is roughly one post every 2 minutes for 5 straight hours. Then after stopping just before midnight, he came back at 5:48 a.m. Tuesday morning and posted, "Truth Social is the best. There is nothing even close." And immediately, the narrative machine kicked into high gear. Democratic influencers called it a mental breakdown. Media outlets published concerned articles about his cognitive state. Critics pointed to it as evidence of declining mental fitness. One prominent Democratic voice said, "If your family member did this, you'd stage an intervention." But here's what nobody in that chorus of concern is asking. What if this wasn't random? What if this wasn't manic? What if this was exactly what it appeared to be on the surface? A president communicating directly with his base, bypassing traditional media filters, flooding the information space with his messaging at a moment when he felt it was strategically important. Let me walk you through what actually happened during those 5 hours, because the details reveal a pattern that most analysis completely misses. Trump wasn't just randomly firing off thoughts. He was curating and amplifying a specific set of narratives across multiple themes that matter to his political strategy. He shared content about Mark Kelly and the Democratic senators who made that video telling military personnel they can refuse illegal orders. He promoted conspiracy theories about Michelle Obama allegedly using Biden's autopen to sign pardons. He attacked familiar targets like Nancy Pelosi, Gavin Newsom, Adam Schiff, Eric Holder. He shared flattering videos about Melania. He posted Christmas content, including his Home Alone cameo. He amplified messages about reverse migration and the Minnesota Somali community. He demanded the release of Tina Peters, the Colorado clerk convicted in the election fraud case. And he reshared dozens of posts from supporters praising his leadership, his policies, his vision for America. Now you can look at that list and see chaos, random targets, scattershot messaging. Or you can see what I see, which is a deliberate information campaign hitting specific audiences with specific messages designed to reinforce specific narratives. The variety isn't confusion. It is comprehensive messaging across the entire spectrum of issues his base cares about. And here's the key thing that separates Trump's communication style from traditional political messaging. Most politicians craft careful statements through communications teams, release them at optimal times for media coverage, and hope journalists cover them favorably. Trump does the opposite. He floods the zone. He overwhelms the information space with so much content that even hostile media has to cover at least some of it. He speaks directly to supporters without any filter or editing, and he does it at times when he knows his base is most active online, which for many working-class Americans is evening hours after work, when they're scrolling social media. So while critics see 160 posts as evidence of mania, his supporters see a president who is actually communicating with them, actually engaging, actually sharing information they care about, rather than carefully managed PR statements. Let's analyze what Trump actually posted, because content matters more than volume. The heaviest concentration came in the final hour, between 11 p.m. and midnight, with roughly 100 posts, just in that 60-minute window. That is not random late-night rambling. That is a coordinated information, dump-timed for maximum exposure during peak social media hours. What was he posting? A significant portion was resharing content from conservative media figures and MAGA-aligned accounts. Fox News clips, commentary from personalities like Benny Johnson, segments featuring conservative analysts, videos from Alex Jones, InfoWars. He was amplifying voices that already support his agenda, Signal, boosting them to his massive following. Every time Trump reposts someone, that person gains followers, gains credibility within MAGA circles, gains influence. So part of what he is doing is building and strengthening a media ecosystem that is aligned with his political goals. Then, there were the direct attacks on political opponents. Mark Kelly got hit repeatedly, with Trump calling him and 5 other Democratic senators who appeared in that military video the seditious six, and saying their behavior is punishable by death. Now, that is obviously inflammatory rhetoric that his critics jump on as reckless. But think about the strategic purpose. Kelly is a potential Democratic presidential candidate. He is a military veteran with centrist appeal. He represents exactly the kind of Democrat who could be competitive in swing states. By aggressively attacking him now, Trump is defining Kelly negatively before he can build a national profile. It is preemptive political warfare. Same logic applies to Gavin Newsom, who appeared multiple times as a target. Newsom is clearly positioning for a presidential run. Trump is trying to damage him early, associating him with California's problems, with failed progressive policies, with the kind of governance Trump's base rejects. The conspiracy content is where critics get most exercised, and it is worth examining what is actually happening there. Trump shared the Alex Jones clip about Michelle Obama, allegedly using AutoPen to sign pardons. He promoted claims about Tulsi Gabbard having documents exposing Obama's role in Russiagate. He reshared content about election fraud, about undocumented immigrants voting, about Serbian IP addresses, manipulating voting machines. Now, are these claims verified? Number. Are they pushing boundaries of what is factually defensible? Absolutely. But here's the thing. Trump's base doesn't trust mainstream fact-checkers. They don't trust traditional media verification. They see those institutions as politically biased against Trump. So when Trump shares this content, he is signaling to his supporters that he is willing to amplify voices and ideas that establishment sources reject. He is positioning himself as someone who questions official narratives rather than accepting them uncritically. Whether that is responsible leadership is a separate question from whether it is effective political communication, and it is clearly effective with his target audience. Then there was softer content mixed in. The Melania videos, the Christmas messaging, the Home Alone clip, posts praising him as the greatest president to ever live. This isn't just ego, this is brand maintenance. Trump understands that political support isn't purely transactional based on policy positions. It is emotional, tribal, identity-based. People support leaders they admire, who they feel proud to associate with, who represent something larger than specific legislative priorities. So showing Melania as elegant First Lady, Trump as beloved cultural figure, appearing in classic films, supporters expressing passionate devotion, all of that reinforces the emotional connection his base feels to him personally. It is not narcissism. It is branding. Now let's talk about the gap between how this was covered and what it actually represents. Because this gap reveals something fundamental about political communication in the social media age. Media coverage focused almost entirely on the volume and timing of posts as evidence of concerning behavior. Articles used words like manic, frenzied, extraordinary avalanche, suggesting something abnormal or unhealthy was happening. Democratic influencers called it a mental breakdown, suggested interventions, framed it as proof Trump is unwell. The assumption underlying all of that coverage is that normal, healthy people don't post 160 times in 5 hours. Therefore, Trump doing so indicates he is not well. But that assumption only makes sense if you think presidents should communicate the way previous presidents did, through official statements, press conferences, carefully managed media appearances. Trump rejects that entire model. He sees it as giving away control of his message to hostile intermediaries who will distort, edit, and spin whatever he says. So from his perspective, posting directly and frequently isn't abnormal. It is the only rational response to a media environment he views as fundamentally adversarial. Every time he posts, he is communicating directly with tens of millions of followers, without any filter. Why would he limit himself to once or twice a day, when he can reach people constantly throughout the day? The idea that there is something wrong with high-volume social media communication only makes sense if you accept traditional media gatekeepers as legitimate and necessary. Trump doesn't accept that. His supporters don't accept that. They see mainstream media as partisan opposition, not neutral referees. So when Trump floods Truth Social with posts, they see a president working hard to keep them informed, to share information the mainstream media won't cover, to fight back against narratives they see as false. The volume isn't concerning to them. It is energizing. And here is where the age narrative gets interesting. For months, media and Democrats have been pushing a story that Trump is slowing down, napping in the Oval Office, starting work late, showing signs of physical and mental decline. We just covered the MRI release that contradicted the physical health concerns. Now we have 5 hours of intense social media activity late into the night, followed by posting again early in the morning. That is not the behavior of someone who is fading or declining. That is someone who is clearly engaged, clearly energetic, clearly focused on his political goals. So the same behavior that critics point to as evidence of mania could just as easily be interpreted as evidence of vigor and commitment. The frame you apply determines what you see. If you are predisposed to think Trump is declining, you interpret high-volume posting as manic behavior. If you are predisposed to support Trump, you interpret it as a president who is working around the clock to communicate with Americans. There is also a generational dimension here that is worth noting. Trump is 79, but he has adopted communication patterns, more typical of much younger people who grew up with social media. Most people his age don't post constantly, don't engage directly with supporters online, don't use platforms as primary communication channels. They use traditional media or official statements. Trump uses social media, the way millennials and Gen Z do, as a direct connection to community, as a real-time conversation, as a way to share reactions and thoughts as they occur. That is unusual for someone his age, but it is not unusual behavior in general. It is just unusual for a president. And unusual doesn't mean unhealthy or concerning. It just means different from what we're used to. So let's think about this from a strategic perspective, because everything Trump does politically has strategic logic, even when it looks chaotic on the surface. What did this posting spree accomplish? First, it completely dominated the news cycle. Every major outlet covered it. Political analysts talked about it. Social media was full of discussion and debate. That is attention, and attention is the most valuable commodity in modern politics. Even if much of the coverage was critical, it put Trump back at the center of the conversation. It reminded everyone that he is active, engaged, and driving the discourse. Second, it reinforced his direct connection with supporters. Every post that speaks to their concerns, that validates their beliefs, that attacks their enemies, strengthens the tribal bond between Trump and his base. That is not about persuading skeptics. It is about maintaining and energizing the coalition that already supports him. Third, it flooded the information space with narratives he wants circulating. The Mark Kelly attacks, the conspiracy theories, the anti-establishment messaging, all of that is now out there being discussed, shared, debated. Even if mainstream media dismisses it, it is reaching Trump's base through social media networks. That is parallel information distribution. He is building and maintaining an alternative information ecosystem where his preferred narratives can spread without being filtered by hostile fact checkers or journalists. Fourth, it demonstrated energy and engagement at a moment when Democrats are questioning his vigor. You can't credibly claim someone is in decline when they're posting 160 times in 5 hours late into the night. The behavior itself contradicts the narrative his opponents want to build. So in one extended session of social media activity, Trump accomplished multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. That is not mania. That is effective use of modern communication tools. Now, is there risk in this approach? Absolutely. The conspiracy content exposes him to legitimate criticism. The inflammatory rhetoric about the seditious six and punishment by death gives opponents ammunition. The sheer volume of posting allows critics to frame him as unstable or obsessive. But Trump clearly believes those risks are worth it, because the benefits outweigh them. He maintains direct communication with his base, without any intermediaries, who might soften or contextualize his message. He sets the agenda, rather than responding to media-driven narratives. He keeps his political opponents constantly on defense, constantly responding to his attacks, rather than advancing their own agendas. And he demonstrates to supporters that he is fighting for them relentlessly, that he is not backing down despite criticism, that he is willing to break all the traditional rules of presidential communication to connect with them directly. That is valuable, politically, even if it is controversial stylistically. There is also a question of whether this kind of communication style will remain effective or whether it faces diminishing returns over time. Trump's been doing high-volume social media posting for years now. His base is used to it, expects it, appreciates it. But does it still generate the same level of attention and engagement as it did when it was novel? That is harder to assess. What is clear is that Trump believes it is still working, still worth his time and effort, still generating political benefits that justify the criticism it generates. And until that calculus changes, until he sees evidence that this approach is becoming counterproductive, he is likely to continue using it regardless of what critics say. So what should we take away from Trump's 160-post Monday night marathon? First, that presidential communication has fundamentally changed, and there is no going back to the old model. Whether you like Trump's approach or hate it, he has demonstrated that direct social media communication can be more effective politically than filtered traditional media coverage. Future presidents will have to grapple with that reality. They'll either adopt similar strategies or find themselves at a disadvantage, competing for attention and narrative control. Second, that the gap between how mainstream media frames Trump's behavior and how his supporters interpret it continues to widen. What looks like concerning mania to critics looks like energetic engagement to supporters. That perceptual divide isn't bridgeable through more fact-checking or more criticism. It reflects fundamentally different views about what sources of information are trustworthy and what behavior is appropriate for political leaders. Third, that Trump's political strategy relies heavily on maintaining an intensely loyal base rather than expanding to persuade skeptics. Everything about that posting spree was designed to reinforce existing support rather than reach new audiences. The content, the tone, the targets, all of it speaks to people who already agree with him. That is a viable political strategy in a closely divided country where mobilizing your base can be more important than persuading undecideds. But it also means Trump's coalition has probably reached its ceiling. He is not expanding support through this kind of communication. He is deepening and maintaining it. Fourth, that age and cognitive fitness will remain a contested battlefield in American politics. Trump's posting spree contradicts the decline narrative his opponents push, but his critics will continue pushing it regardless because it is one of the few vulnerabilities Trump has that resonates with some voters. The back and forth over his health, his energy, his mental acuity, that is going to continue throughout his term. And fifth, that we're all going to have to get used to this being the new normal. Trump isn't going to stop posting prolifically. His supporters aren't going to start seeing it as concerning. His critics aren't going to stop framing it as evidence of problems. And media outlets are going to keep covering it because it generates attention and engagement. So we're stuck in this cycle where Trump posts, critics react, supporters defend, media covers the controversy, and the entire pattern repeats endlessly. That is exhausting if you are trying to focus on substantive policy issues. But it is also the reality of how political communication works in the social media age. The question isn't whether Trump should post differently. He is clearly not going to. The question is whether voters ultimately care more about his communication style or about what he actually does as president. And that is the question that will determine his political fate and his legacy. If you found this analysis helpful and want to understand how modern political communication actually works beneath the surface-level headlines, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment with your honest take. Do you think Trump's posting spree was strategic or concerning? Does volume of communication matter or just content? Your perspective matters because we're all trying to figure out what political leadership looks like in the social media age. Stay informed, think critically about competing narratives, and let's keep analyzing what is actually happening versus what we're told is happening.